Fantasy VII being relevant again, and series like Fruits Basket, Shaman King, and Tokyo Mew Mew all getting reboots, it can be really easy to feel like, well, if there were any anime conventions happening in 2020, then they might be showing a bit of resemblance to the way cons looked 10 to 15 years ago. And while that is definitely true in some regards, it's also pretty far from the truth in others. And there is perhaps nothing more symbolic of those differences than a cursed item called the Yaoi paddle. Indeed, if you were at pretty much any anime convention between 2005 and 7, then for a mere $35, you could own the most controversial mass-produced item in the English-speaking anime fan community at the time. But what made these paddles so controversial, you may be wondering? Well, there's a lot of things really, and we'll get to talking more about them later, but it was mostly the fact that a lot of con-goers were effectively using them as unchecked weapons. So then, what were the paddles and where did they come from? What made them so controversial and what happened to them? Why was there any patch of time at all where this wouldn't get you immediately thrown out of a convention? And also, didn't I make a video about this about a year ago? Well, you know, I'll go ahead and answer that last question now. Yes, I did, but I was pretty inexperienced when I made that first video, so this time I have way more information from way more sources. Personally, I think this version is way better. So then, without any further ado, let me tell you all about it. For better or for worse, the Yaoi paddle is exactly what it sounds like. It is a wooden paddle with the word yaoi on it, and for the sake of keeping this video ad-friendly, I'm gonna go ahead and hope and assume that you already know what the word yaoi means.
Otamura-san! What does yaoi mean? That depends on which one you mean.
There were Sama and Uke variants also, and Yuri paddles were also a thing, but they were nowhere near as popular as the Yaoi paddle. But anyways, these paddles were a pretty popular item back at anime conventions between 2005 and 7, and they were sold by a hentai selling booth called Hendene. Some of the older con-goers watching this video will almost certainly remember them as that booth where the people were constantly yelling, and I'm very happy to report, by the way, that while they do still sell at conventions, they have long since stopped the yelling. Anyways, cons then were smaller than they are now, and by extension, it meant that security was also a lot smaller than it tends to be today too. But, you know, people were nonetheless thrilled to be at these cons. In fact, the most thrilled people tended to be the younger and more impressionable anime fans hoping to make friends that share their hobbies. And so that's how the sense of boundaries for a lot of these con-goers just kinda went out the door. And before Yaoi paddles, this often manifested in another often unwelcome gesture called glomping, and that's a kind of tackle hug that happened a lot even during and after the Yaoi paddles time, but that's a totally separate topic for a totally separate day. But anyways, the Yaoi paddle itself was originally made with the idea of being a joke item, so once the Yaoi paddle became the new medium through which that lack of boundaries was expressed, these paddlers usually thought that they were being funny and friendly when they paddled people. More specifically, it was usually people cosplaying as characters that they liked. Although to a lesser extent than boundary and behavioral issues, there were also some concerns about how the paddlings that happened at conventions resembled hazing rituals, but we'll talk a little bit more about those concerns later. Anyways, the bottom line here is that between 2005 and 7, if you were cosplaying as a popular character, then unfortunately you ran a very real risk of getting smacked with a paddle because No Boundaries Billy Bob thought it would be a super hilarious way to start a conversation with you. Yeah, spoiler alert, it was not super hilarious at all. And a few years and more than a few injuries and complaints later, the Yaoi paddle finally started getting banned from conventions in the late 2000s. As of when I am making this video, they haven't been sold in an official capacity in at least 5 years. So what happened to the Yaoi paddle then? Where did they come from? And why did people think that these were a good idea for a while? And what finally made people realize that, hey, maybe selling an item that a large number of con-goers are using as unchecked weapons is a bad idea? Well, our story begins at a craft store in Cleveland almost 20 years ago. When Mike isn't staffing anime conventions, he quite enjoys wood burning. So when he notices some grainy pinewood paddles on sale at his local craft store, it doesn't take him long to think of a fun way to utilize them. So he buys one and burns the word yaoi into it, and he gives it to his friend Brian, the owner of Hendane, as he would frequently joke about just how much of Hendane's sales were made purely from yaoi. Nobody seems to remember the precise when and where the first yaoi paddle was bestowed upon its owner, but it's thought to have been sometime between 2002 and 3. Less unclear, however, is just how much this paddle helped business. Like I said earlier, Hendane was known for being pretty loud, to put it nicely, and this paddle was initially put to use as a prop to help them grab attention and sell their wares. You know, the idea was that it would give their customers a good laugh, and to Hendane's credit, yeah, they were right. It absolutely did. In fact, it gave a lot of customers such a good laugh that they wanted to know how or if they could get a paddle of their own. And that's when the idea that the yaoi paddle could be a sellable product was born. Hendane got the rights to mass-produce the paddles, although, you know, the phrase mass-produced wasn't entirely accurate at first because the first 20 to 30 paddles were hand-burned by Mike. Quickly realizing that this was nowhere near enough supply to match the demand, Mike's more square yaoi paddles with the matte finish were quickly replaced with the rounder, glossier, and certainly much more easy to mass-produce ones that we're more familiar with. There seems to be a little more fuzziness regarding which con was the first they were sold at, but it's believed to have been either Anime Expo 2004 or Yaoi Con, probably of 2003, and they were being sold for $35 each, which adjusted for inflation would be about $45 today. Their con-wide popularity wasn't totally immediate, but by the end of the summer of 2004, they were starting to catch on. Like, a lot. One of my sources from within Hendane told me that while yaoi paddles were at their peak, they'd have to stuff them into suitcases that could fit about 500 of them at a time. Most cons would usually relieve them of about 200 of those paddles, but there were some short bursts of time at some conventions where they were even selling a paddle a minute. And the paddle's popularity was probably at its most apparent at Anime Weekend Atlanta, which housed a panel called Yaoi After Dark. This panel wasn't exclusive to AWA, but it was nonetheless the main con that it became associated with. While this panel wasn't owned or hosted by Hendane, the paddles were nonetheless popular enough props at the panel to get the owner invited as something of a co-panelist at least once. Chris, one of Hendane's founders who attended one of these panels, recalled seeing him, quote, hit a guy hard enough to not cause serious harm per se, but the con-goer sure felt it the day after. Weird days. I do want to make it clear though that my saying that isn't a criticism of what Brian did, but more of an observation at the moment. The panel was wild and people really were lining up to get smacked in the ass with a paddle. Yeah, Chris isn't kidding, by the way. One of the main attractions of this panel was literally people voluntarily lining up to get smacked with the paddle. Perhaps the most vivid recollection of this comes from an academic paper from 2008 about the yaoi subculture. It recalls that in 2008, the panel started out with people volunteering to line up to get paddled, and they were asked if they wanted to get hit hard or soft. But before long, people were replying to the question with comments of,
"You can't spank me hard enough,"
or
"Surprise me."
The reaction of the audience was a direct factor in this exchange, because when a person endured a particularly hard paddling or made a provocative comment, the crowd responded with an empathetic ouch or supportive cheer. The reaction of the audience then appeared to influence the paddling participants, because once the crowd began giving an enthusiastic reaction, a majority of the participants requested a hard paddling or made provocative comments. I can't say this for an absolute fact, but while AWA's Yaoi After Dark was definitely the most popular panel integrating the yaoi paddles, I wouldn't be shocked to hear if there were other panels at other cons that were integrating them too. After all, if I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times. They were pretty popular around this time. In fact, they were so popular that one of my sources from within Hendane told me of an incident where one of the aforementioned suitcases full of yaoi paddles got lost in receivership in Toronto. Not too long after that, they recall the paddles being sold for a few hundreds of dollars online, although no archived posts or sales listings for these transactions seem to have survived. Although, side note, unless you were the buyer or seller of a given transaction, then eBay doesn't really have an effective archive system, much less an archive system where anyone can access the page of any given sale from upwards of 10 years ago. So what I'm getting at here is that the fact that there are no archived sales listings for these paddles doesn't really prove or disprove much of anything. In any case, 2005 through 7 were definitely when the Yaoi paddle's popularity was at its peak. As a matter of fact, they were so well known during this time that Gaia Online made a Yaoi paddle item called the Y paddle in 2009. It was one of the items that you could get from the G-Boy Turbo. And Gaia Online, in case you don't already know, was once one of the biggest hubs for younger anime fans on the internet. If that doesn't tell you all it needs to about what the general attitude toward Yaoi paddles was at the time, not to mention who they were clearly favored by, then, God, I don't know what will. But still, the timing of the Y paddle's release is kind of interesting because around the same time it made its debut on Gaia, cons were starting to seriously shift the way they dealt with Yaoi paddles. More specifically, they were starting to ban them. In fact, some cons already had. While most paddle owners seem to use their paddles at least mostly responsibly, alas, the same could not be said for their more, overexcited owners. Yeah, so all too often, just out and about in any given con, these overexcited paddlers would see someone cosplaying as the character of their affection, and with no warning, that cosplayer would soon feel the distinct sensation of wood striking their costumed butt. And while sometimes it was just a light tap, and sometimes it was indeed done with consent, yeah, also sometimes it was very much not. There are plenty of Yaoi paddle horror stories out there, but all of them highlight the fact that pretty much the only people who actually liked the paddles were the paddlers themselves. And no group was more acutely aware of just how much the paddles were getting on people's nerves than con staffers who heard complaint after complaint about these things. For example, an Acon representative posted about her concern after seeing a kid going around smacking people without consent in 2006. Former Otakon chair, longtime director for guest and industry, and longtime board member and current guest panel MC, Jim Voles, recalled to me about the paddles that, quote, Otakon had either confiscated a few Yaoi paddles or booted folks for making contact with them, but the complaints kept coming and people were getting bolder about swatting their friends and sometimes strangers. And it wasn't just larger cons that felt this way. As a matter of fact, Yaoi Con, of all cons, was another one of the earlier cons to start actively addressing concerns over the paddle. Given that it's a whole con dedicated to Yaoi, I definitely would not blame you for thinking that surely they, of all cons, would have loved the paddles, but it was actually quite the opposite. Yeah, remember how earlier I mentioned that I would touch on the hazing concerns later on in the video? Yeah, well, later is now. There is a post from December of 2006 on the Anime Con's mailing list archive where a representative from Yaoi Con says that paddles come across as a type of encouragement to actually initiate unsuspecting young men and persons into the Yaoi fold by paddling. We've had some of our own members thwacked both at our con and other cons without consent, mostly by overzealous teenage girls, enough that a complaint was raised and we decided to ban them from sale. This sentiment was echoed by Rob Miles, a former member of Yaoi Con's convention operations and programming, who reiterated to me that the con decided to ban the paddles because they were dangerous and because the con felt like they were taking away from what the medium and platform for the convention was about. Anyways, I'm telling you about all this because the aforementioned post in the Anime Con's mailing archive mentions that, quote, Yaoi Con has a specific prohibition in our codes of conduct with regard to the paddles and have had issues with them in the past. We do not allow any of our dealers to sell them simply on principle. In other words, as early as December of 2006, Yaoi Con was at least making plans of banning the Yaoi paddle, and I say making plans only because I wasn't able to get into contact with anyone who could tell me more about this, and Hendane couldn't recall getting approached about a paddle ban until 2007, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Anyways, Yaoi Con wasn't the only con making plans like these. In the same thread, Yaoi Con's founder, Erica Friedman, states that at one of the con's upcoming events, they've established a no signage policy that includes paddles, which are further banned as weapons and as being highly irritating. In July of the following year, she'd make a blog post that goes into more detail about why she wasn't a fan of the paddles, and by extension, why they were officially banned from Yaoi Con as well. The other con in the thread that mentioned that they were making steps toward getting rid of the paddles is Sakura Con. More specifically, the representative says that they've already voted on banning the paddles for pretty much the same reasons as Yaoi and Yaoi Con. Though, interestingly, they also express concern about the risk of having one of the convention center representatives taking offense, or worse, getting thwacked as a joke. Fast forward to the weekend of SakuraCon 2007, which was by far the earliest of those three cons. Hendane has not been informed that SakuraCon voted to ban the paddles, so there they are at the con, suitcases full of yaoi paddles in hand, you know, same old, or at least it was same old, till SakuraCon's fears were confirmed. Hendane recalls being approached at the con and being told that at least one attendee has hit at least one of the venue's employees with a paddle. How many attendees it was, how many employees, or how hard they were hit, nobody seems to remember, but it didn't really matter because they were told to stop selling paddles right then and there, effectively creating the first yaoi paddle ban that Hendane knew about. Footnote: the foreshadowing of this event in the December 2006 post is eye-catching, to say the least, and I tried reaching out to SakuraCon and the former representative who made this post, but alas, nothing really came of that. Everyone I've spoken to at Hendane, on the other hand, recalls being told that a venue employee got hit. But, you know, regardless of the details, the bottom line is that Hendane was approached and told to stop selling yaoi paddles at SakuraCon 2007, and this ban would be extended to con attendees the next year. From there, other cons were pretty quick to follow yaoi, Yuri, and SakuraCon's examples, and by 2010, yaoi paddles had been phased out of pretty much every major con in North America. They lingered on in a few European conventions for a few more years, MCN London being by far the most prominent among them, but between an increasing number of con goers who were getting fed up with the paddles, the growing awareness of boundaries at cons largely via the cosplay is not consent movement, and Hendane's dwindling supply of paddles, they seemed to disappear from these cons as well by 2015. In fact, quite possibly a bit earlier. Hendane said to me about the mass bannings of the paddles. At first our response was, well, we'll sell them with the idea that as soon as you bought it, it had to go in your car or hotel. This worked for a short time until conventions considered them weapons, and we had to deal with a whole new process of either applying as a weapons vendor, not an easy thing, or just dropping them altogether. So we dropped them from production and from cons. The last con we sold paddles at was 2011 in Denmark. I believe the convention was called J-Pop Con. We would have sold the remaining paddles we had after, but due to a shipping error, the final batch of paddles, a bag of about 45 of them, was entirely lost. Whether or not that bag still exists anywhere is a good question. Chris told me, it still boggles my mind to this day that a joke gift from a friend turned into our one and only true original merchandise that's caused dealer contracts to be rewritten to ban paddles. Mike, whose guess is that anywhere between 8,000 and 10,000 paddles were made before they were finally taken out of production, added, yaoi paddles were a big part of con culture, maybe good for some people, but definitely ruined by others. If I could take myself back to the day I was standing in Pat Catan's and something snapped in my head to make it, I probably would just walk away now. Even Hendane themselves now openly admit to how dangerous the yaoi paddle was in its prime. In fact, they, more than most people, are hyper aware of all the problems that the paddles caused. And how did they get this hyper awareness, you may be wondering? Well, remember, the yaoi paddle bans happened before social media was a big thing, so for con goers who wanted to know what happened to the paddles, wanted to share their stories, or often both, Hendane was pretty much the only place most of them could think to go. And so, for well over a decade, Hendane became the main hub for Yaoi paddle information. And unless you knew people in the convention running scene, then they were the only primary source most con-goers had easy access to. Or at least, that is, until May of 2019, when I posted a video on what happened to the Yaoi paddle. Now, I had never made a video like that before at the time. I was pretty inexperienced, so unfortunately, I fell into the exact same trap that 10 plus years of con-goers before me had, that I had only asked Hendane for information because I thought that, well, they were the only primary source that I had access to. That is a massive mistake that I definitely would not have made if I were making the video for the first time now, but, you know, live and learn, I don't really know what else to say. Anyways, so why is this such a big mistake? Well, it's because I only got Hendane's side of the story, and while their side of the story is definitely important to all this, it's not the only side. Now, let me remind you of something I mentioned just a moment ago, that in the years following the paddle's death, Hendane became a hub for Yaoi paddle horror stories, and they'd share these stories with people who asked, and these people would also generally share theirs too. And while this did help some cautionary tales make their way across the con circuit, it was also effectively a cross-country game of telephone that lasted well over 10 years. So it was perhaps inevitable that somewhere down the line, information would get misunderstood. One of the questions I asked Hendane when I was doing my research for that video was if they could tell me the most brutal Yaoi paddle story that they'd ever heard. And sure enough, they delivered. They told me a story of how someone at Otakon got hit with a paddle so hard that it left the victim paralyzed and the paddler in prison. And because I was inexperienced at the time and lacked connections, the thought just never occurred to me to try to find older Otakon volunteers who might have been able to tell me more about this. Which, in a nutshell, is why I decided to include it in the video. A year later, or about a month ago as of when this video was being made, Otakon heard about this and told me point blank that this story just wasn't true. In fact, the story Hendane heard was almost certainly a mutation of a story that's on Nerd Reactor, where an interviewee talks about how they have an injury on their lower spine and getting hit by Yaoi paddles sends very painful resonance throughout their entire body that leaves them almost paralyzed for short periods of time. To reiterate though, just for the sake of clarity, Hendane did not know that the story they told me was untrue when they told it to me. Again, cross-country game of telephone. Information just got mixed up. And while it was neither mine nor Hendane's intention to mislead anyone, I'm nonetheless not a big fan of spreading such a big piece of misinformation if I can avoid it, and I'm sorry I didn't think to do more looking into that story at the time. I assure you I know much better now. But, you know, that's why I figured, well, I got way more experience under my belt now. I could totally make a bigger and better video about the history of the Yaoi paddle, so that, dear viewers, is exactly what this video is, and I really do hope that you've been enjoying it because, well, I don't know, I enjoy being the self-proclaimed Yaoi paddle historian. But, you know, to get this all wrapped up, while it's easy to look back at the Yaoi paddles as a funny, quirky relic of Con's past, let's go ahead and leave them there in the past, because while I'm confident that con-goers these days, even the younger ones, have enough sense to not go around smacking random cosplayers, that's not exactly a theory that I want to put to the test. So, in conclusion, the lessons to be taken home from this are to be thankful that the cosplay is not consent movement is around, to appreciate security at your local con, respect people's boundaries, don't be afraid to admit when you messed up, and of course, last but, oh, certainly not least, to keep an eye out, because in that same lost art abyss that the Just Judges panel, the Storm at the Sea of Galilee, and the concert are, you might, just might, also find a bag full of 45 Yaoi paddles. Seriously, I would absolutely love to know where this thing is. It is as elusive as ever, and I still have no more information on it now than I did a year ago, but believe me, I want it.
You can't spank me hard enough. You can't spank me hard enough. You spank me? Don't make me laugh. The likes of you spanking me hard enough?